All right, Prof. Watson.
Yes.
All right, we're at 1 o'clock now, and we are live streaming, so over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this the second webinar of the virtual webinar of SALISES on the theme New Economy Models, Post-COVID-19 Policies for Productivity, Health, and Social Wealth. We are going to be joined here by 4 panelists who are going to make a presentation of 15 minutes each. I'm asking the panelists in advance that because this is so novel to all of us, try not to go beyond the 15 minutes, because I will have to intervene if that happens, and I don't want to do that. Not to mention the fact that I may find it a little bit uncomfortable to do so in this kind of environment. Our panelists are Dr. Patricia Northover, who's a senior fellow at the SALISES. I will introduce her more fully when the time comes. Mr. Donald Danny Roberts, who is head of the Hugh Scherer Labor Studies Institute at Mona. Dr. Priya Mohan, who is a SALISES fellow at the St. Augustine campus. And Mr. Hugh Johnson, who is the president of the Small Business Association of Jamaica. I want to especially welcome the panelists. I want to welcome all the participants, in particular our directors, who I'm not yet seeing, but I understand that they are in the audience. We are ready to go, and I will now introduce Pat Northover, who is SALISES senior fellow, and I'm going to not waste much time. I'm going to introduce the topic that she'll speak on. And so, Pat, I hope you're ready to go with your topic on settling neoliberal philosophies for a new economy. So, Pat, it's over to you.
Thank you, Professor Watson. Good afternoon, everyone. Just sharing my screen here. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope you will enjoy my presentation. I will begin my presentation today by briefly highlighting contradictions of development in the time of COVID. I hope to address in this presentation 2 basic questions. What would it mean to reopen and build economies that are healthier and fairer? And how should one craft new economies in a responsible fashion? So let me begin. Development is a project that is full of contradictions. Global capitalism has rested, for example, on extreme forms of inequality and racial power dynamics. These have enabled the extraordinary accumulation of power and wealth that we see today from east to west. But the price paid for this progress has been unacceptably high, its fruit toxic, and its path unsustainable. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, launched just 5 years ago, ostensibly to save humanity and the planet in the context of climate change, attests to a global awareness of, if not consensus on, the need for a new deal. In fact, a new dispensation of power in which no one is left behind. However, despite the multitude of reports, conferences, and promises made in the name of sustainable development, the global, regional, and local contradictions have continued. Indeed, life has become even more precarious as we continue to witness, with increasing frequency, outbreaks of health crisis, the growth of global geopolitical rivalries, and resurgent racist nationalisms. These outturns have all preceded the COVID-19 pandemic. And they are all being fed, I would argue, by a neoliberal philosophy of growth and progress that has privatized benefits, but socialized costs and losses, that has placed private interest over the public good, and that has encouraged a logic of capital accumulation by dispossession. For the greater part of our experiences of development then, things have already been going badly and looking more like Faustian bargains that put power and profits over all else. While critical thought and social movements are often dismissed or suppressed, the COVID-19 pandemic, as painfully disruptive as it is, has forced our eyes open and raised the stakes for a full frontal engagement with the patently racial, gendered, and illiberal character of liberal market orders of development. These gaping fault lines have been transparently exposed by the COVID-19's differential impacts and its terms of management. Despite the so-called leveling effect of COVID-19, it is the developing countries, least developed, and small vulnerable economies like the SIDS, the small island developing states of the Caribbean and Pacific, that have borne and will bear the brunt of the economic shocks and their long-term impacts. Moreover, as capital flies to safe havens, de-risking from emerging markets and audaciously transforming debts into junk status, it is clear that risks are being unequally distributed upon our shoulders and asymmetrically managed to favor some dominant interests over others in this global crisis of unprecedented scale that is surpassing the Great Depression of the 1930s. As such, the current concerns being expressed as to how one should not just reopen, but build or craft new economies in a responsible fashion is, I argue, the fundamental question of policy and politics today. COVID-19, by laying bare the contradictions of modern life, has privileged us with a unique moment in the midst of sudden human tragedies and multiplying catastrophes, to examine ourselves and our pathways afresh, and to consider with new eyes the question of responsibility. What would it mean to reopen and build economies that are, for example, greener, smarter, healthier, and fairer? Who are expected to be the winners and losers in a new political economy that is reconfigured? For whose interest and by whose standards will we raise up a new economy? If the dice is loaded and the cards badly drawn, how would responsibility be achieved? And to whom must our policy leads and task forces, as well as states, be accountable to and answerable to? Let me try to make these issues around the question of responsibility more concrete with a brief Jamaica case analysis, which draws attention to the effects of political economies on the deals for newness and for seeking productivity, health, and social wealth. Jamaica, at the end of 25 consistent years of growth, from 1950 to 1973, averaging 6% per annum, was described in a newspaper commentary in 1969 as, I quote, a dangerously sick and divided country. Unemployment, poverty, inequality were prevailing, as well as economic dependency, given colonial and plantation economy legacies. Fast forward to 2020, In the midst of the COVID-19 impacts, it would seem that this comment is again relevant. Jamaica remains a dangerously sick economy and divided country. Why is this so? The crux of the matter, as I see it, is that the country remains based on sharp divides between the haves and the have-nots. And despite the brief and tragically fated state experiment of the 1970s to privilege principles of equality and social justice over extractive growth models, the country has been in the grips of a long siege of neoliberalism operationalized through IMF stabilization policies and IBRD or World Bank structural adjustment programs. These have been sedimented by US aid regimes and its geopolitical surveillance of state posturings in the region. Yet on average, there has been no productivity growth. As you will see in this table, for the period prior since the late 1970s. The IMF 2006 staff report says that Jamaica has experienced a decline in productivity of 0.5% per annum over the period 1960 to 2000, compared to a 0.2% increase in Latin America and a 0.9% increase in the world average. This study points to the deleterious effects instead of the growth of the total public debt on the economy, making investments within the country unproductive. So that while investments have increased significantly in Jamaica under neoliberal opening up, there was no commensurate growth or productivity effect that resulted. Rather, the long decade of high debt shares created macroeconomic uncertainty, fostered an excessive reliance on mature industries such as tourism and mining, and forced a radical decline in public investment, which has triggered the growth of the informal economy. As such, the mode of neoliberal adjustment in Jamaica has largely played out in the interest of creditors and foreign investors, leaving the country trapped in a revolving door of debt, given its fragile dependencies on aid, remittances, and mined-out industries, and given its susceptibility to exogenous shocks, such as COVID-19 pandemic, and environmental events such as hurricanes, but also slow-moving disasters such as droughts. In other words, I believe that neoliberal adjustment has left Jamaica a dangerously sick and divided country. A post-COVID model of economic responsibility surely cannot be built on these foundations. A sick and divided country cannot bounce back. It can only break forward. In contrast, then, to the old and mined-out economic philosophies of illiberal liberalism, a responsible opening up and commitment to a new economic model must, at minimum, break with the sick political economy of the old and renew the political in favor of the people and place the public back at the heart of public interest. For a country like Jamaica, the New World critiques of plantation systems and dependent underdevelopment are still relevant. And long-standing issues such as agrarian reform, innovation policies, especially for the cultural industries, must be placed at the heart of reimagining policy for long-term sustainable development or productivity, health, and social wealth in the future economy. The new economy must be built on sound policies and institutions, that correct for structural asymmetries that have stimulated innovation and have driven the informal economy and the decline in public investment. And I'll just share with you the impacts of debt, as you can see in this slide, which has ranged from a peak of 200% to a current level of approximately a little under 100%, while growth has remained less than 2% on average. If you would look at the patterns of productivity growth over the long period, 1961 to 2000, you see that after 1971, productivity, total factor productivity, which is measured in the purple, has been declining, and it has not made any significant recovery under a process of neoliberal adjustment. In fact, it has been in the negatives since the 1990s. This last graph represents the decline in public investment as a percent of total investment over the period 1988 to 2005. And as you can see here, there has been a dramatic reduction in the level of public investment in Jamaica. This has led, as you can see in this final slide, that the share of the informal sector has grown from 14 or 15% in 1991 to roughly 40% in the year 2000. This has facilitated the survival of many individuals in the informal economy, but both large agents as well as the small and medium-sized business sectors. And I believe that Mr. Hugh Johnson will be able to speak to some of these dynamics in his presentation on this topic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Pat. We now go to the second presenter, who is Donald Roberts, head of the Hugh Scherer Labor Studies Institute, who will speak on the topic labor dynamics. So over to you, Hugh. I think I'm seeing his presentation, so I think he's about to start.
Thank you very much, moderator, Professor Watson, and good afternoon to fellow panelists. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I think it is very clear to us that the COVID pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on our labor market. We have seen globally where millions of jobs have been lost as a result of the crisis. Many small businesses have folded because they are unable to respond to the market demands. And real wages have declined among many salaried and wage earners. In fact, it is estimated that the global impact of the pandemic will result in a 10.7% decline in working hours. And that is equivalent to the job loss of somewhere in the region of 305 million persons. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have seen where the estimate for the decline in working hours, certainly in the second quarter, is going to be somewhere around 10.9%. And that is up from the 1.9% that was estimated in the January to March quarter. And this 10.9% is certainly for the region equivalent to job loss, full-time job loss of somewhere in the region of 31 million workers. The impact of this COVID crisis on Jamaica and indeed the region is going to be felt in the areas of reduced export earnings, weakened production performance, and a fallout in investment. In fact, due to the job losses and the reduced income, what we are seeing is that consumers have now begun to naturally reduce their expenditures, but more importantly, to shift their consumption patterns to more processed food rather than natural homegrown Jamaican food, of which these processed foods are imported. And therefore, when we look at and estimate the likely impact of COVID-19 on the Jamaican economy, the expectation is that the economy is going to be contracting by about 5% in this fiscal year. That although there's going to be increased expenditure in the area of health and social and economic support, there's going to be a commensurate decline in government's revenue, likely to be in double digits over the next couple of months until the end of the fiscal year. We have in fact gotten some assistance to help us in our balance of payment needs of $520 million approval, financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund. And that, of course, is going to be added to our debt stock. So we are going to have to be faced with a situation in the not too distant future where these loans will now have to be repaid. The likely fallout of the labor market, certainly in terms of job and losses, is said to going to be far more impactful on those countries which are either A, dependent on their service sector, B, have higher levels of informality, and C, have weak safeguards against the termination of employment. What this means, therefore, is that these countries are likely to have a very prolonged period of recovery. Now, Jamaica fits that description. Jamaica is one of those countries that has a high dependency on the service sector. About 75% of the service industry contributes to our GDP. There's a high level of informality. It is said about half the economy falls within the informal sector, and we have weak safeguards against termination of employment. Not only full-time persons with permanent contracts are actually covered under our existing legislations. Therefore, if all this represents the conditions that we currently face, the question is, how should a government respond to this crisis? And how important is that response to deal with the issues of which we just spoke? Two things are very important. One is that the response, the policy response of any government, Jamaican government in particular, has to be immediate. But it also has to learn from the lessons of past crises. And for example, when one examines the 2008-2009 economic recession, there are two issues which arose out of that. The first was the need for us to ensure that we preserve workers' attachment to their existing jobs. That is to say that everything should be done and must be done to avoid workers losing their jobs. And secondly, we need to make sure that we put in place macroeconomic policy prescriptions that can restore our employment to the pre-crisis level. And so, specific to COVID-19, what is therefore expected is that labor market policies must therefore be responsive to those issues and to do so in a manner that satisfies two basic objectives. The first of which is that we need to make sure that our economy reopens as quickly as possible. So non-essential economic activities need to be brought back fully on stream as quickly as possible, of course, with due regard to public health and public safety. And the second thing is that we need to ensure that we begin from the standpoint where workers' attachment to their previous employment is intact. That is to say, as the economists put it, to preserve the aggregate stock of firm-specific human capital. And all of these have implications going forward, and Pat quite importantly point to some of the challenges that we face as a country in dealing with the issues even before COVID-19. We have to make sure that whatever policy measures that we put in place allows us to move beyond the very negative productivity outcomes that we have had over the last 50 or so years to much more robust and positive productivity outcomes. And secondly, our growth rate, which in the last 6 to 10 years has been less than 2%, that our recovery in this post-COVID-19 period can no longer return to this anemic growth status, but the growth has to be robust and positive going forward. And this has been a challenge for many countries, again, looking back at the previous economic crisis and the appropriate response. So for example, in the 2008-2009 Great Recession, there was much debate in the United States about the fall in employment rate, the stagnation of wages, and what policies ought to be introduced in order to provide for a full recovery, not only to restore the unemployment rate, but to also make sure that we ensure that workers have adequate economic resources, the ability to be able to improve and increase aggregate demand by having proper wages and salaries. And a study out of that period, the 2008 to 2019 period, a study in the United States showed that in many instances, workers who were recalled to their existing jobs actually suffered no loss of earnings because they were able to benefit from the firm-specific human capital. That is the advantage that obviously would come from workers who would have already had experience and understanding of companies' operations, would have had the right combination of skills, and would have therefore been able to accelerate the recovery process much quicker. Contrast that with those workers who, out of the 2008-2009 recession, had actually lost their jobs, were separated from their jobs. And what the study found is that a significant number of them had a loss in monthly earnings ranging between 2 to 12%. And of course, the level of impact depended on how long they were unemployed and the fact that many have had to change occupation and career. Only in March of this year, a study revealed, authored by economic advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and 2 professors of economics from both Yale and the University of London. Now, their study showed that it was an absolute priority to maintain a sense of attachment of workers to their previous jobs. That is to say that everything must be done to ensure that workers are not separated from their jobs, because the process of recovery will be much more difficult than otherwise. And secondly, that governments ought to do everything in their powers to ensure that viable businesses remains open, because they are going to rebound once the health crisis is resolved. So what COVID-19 actually done is created a temporary setback, not a permanent setback, a temporary setback. But what is more, the real issue is how the government respond to the crisis to ensure that we not only recover, but that we firmly root ourselves into a situation in which much of the structural weaknesses which exacerbated the crisis as we have it, that those would be overcome and we'll be put in a better position to ensure that we can withstand future crises, whether it's big economic or health. And the fact of the matter is, as the research has shown, you only get a chance once. This is the only shot we have to get it right. Of course, we know that a breakthrough in the treatment of the virus, the mutation of the virus, social distances, warmer season, can all contribute to bringing the pandemic under control within a short period of time. But the bottom line is that whatever policy responses we develop, that an underlying feature of that policy response must be an aggressive public health campaign. Therefore, the question that we need to pose then is how, at this point in time, is how should we approach the reopening of the economy? I want to talk a little about the tourism sector because that is, we're due to begin to accept tourist arrivals on the 15th of June. How should we deal with the reopening of our economy? Recognizing its importance to ensure the continued sustenance of economic activities and to protect the interest and welfare of the population, but at the same time to safeguard issues of health and safety, which is of paramount importance. And there's an interesting quote from the Secretary General of the International Labour Organization, Guy Ryder, at a recent forum for tourism interest at the G20 group. He said, and I quote, "The immediate imperative is to assure the survival of tourism enterprises through the large-scale public support, without which they will disappear before the virus does. And that support must extend to the workers concerned who would otherwise have no income or social protection."
Danny,
So
I think you should be wrapping up. Your time has come to an end, so I'll give you a few more minutes just to wrap up.
Oh, okay. All right. So what we have, therefore, is a situation in which the crisis is before us. How we respond is going to be very important. And I offer some probably sobering statistics because part of what drives the question of reopening is fear. Globally, 5.8% of those persons who have been affected by the virus has died, 48% has recovered. The US, which is an outlier, 5% of those persons infected have died, 37% have recovered. And in Jamaica's case, only 1.7% of the persons infected have died and 61 recovered. But we also need to bear in mind that in countries like Grenada, St. Kitts, Dominica, St. Lucia, there have been no death and almost 100% recovery. Therefore, what it means is that the kind of policy response that we need to be able to preserve our labor market and to ensure that we put it on a sound footing for the future has to involve policy responses that protect workers in the economy, both in the areas of health, income, job, and social protection, that stimulate the economy and create jobs, particularly among our youth, and that deepen social dialogue and consultation, that is to say, have all the stakeholders involved in the way going forward. The fact of the matter is, Jamaica is one of the few countries that have not responded to COVID crisis with policy measures aimed at protecting the labor market. Some countries have introduced measures to prevent job losses and have introduced wage subsidy. we have not done any of those. What we have been involved largely in is cash transfers. So as we approach the reopening of the Jamaican economy, we recognize that there's now a correlation between a positive labor market outcome and our public health measures. And the WHO has recommended that testing and tracing is the most important factor to consider in a reopening, because it causes less labor market disruptions than quarantining, isolation, and lockdown. So in going forward, even as we speak about the tourism sector, the ability to test and to trace would provide a level of public confidence that boosts economic activities.
Okay, Danny.
So there are two areas, therefore, in which our response has to be. Legislative measures, which provide income protection, social protection, and job protection, as well as policy measures that create employment, particularly among the young population. We have a 25% unemployment among our youth, in order to be able to create a more robust and better future. I'll stop there since we're running out of time.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you very, very much. Could you mute your mic now, please? And before I go to Priya, our next presenter, I want to remind those in the audience, those who are on Zoom, that they can ask questions in the Q&A section, and the YouTube viewers can post questions to the panelists in the comment section. So, I'm looking forward to the questions, and as I have to begin getting ready for that. And I'm going to ask Priya Mohan, SALISES Fellow at the St. Augustine campus, to deal with the issue of the dual risks of COVID-19 and hurricanes. So Priya, it's up to you, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Watson. Good afternoon, everyone. I will be taking off where Pat and Danny would have left off. I'll add to some of the information that they would have provided, and I will also give some new information. If you hear that background noise you're hearing, is the heavy downpour that we're currently experiencing in Trinidad at the time. And I say that to introduce the topic of the dual. Are you all hearing me?
Yes, Dr. Priya, go ahead.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. The dual risk of COVID-19 and hurricanes. So as we all know, COVID-19 is spreading human and economic suffering worldwide. The virus is contagious economically as it is medically. The COVID-19 outbreak was triggered in December 2019 in the city of Wuhan, China. On 11th March 2020, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. COVID-19 remains very much a health crisis, and cases and deaths continue to rise across the globe. We have over 6.5 million cases and over 386,000 deaths, and these figures may have already changed. While some countries have been able to effectively treat and isolate reported cases, it is uncertain where and when new cases will emerge. We have seen the epicenter of the virus move from Wuhan to Italy to Spain to New York and the rest of the US, and more recently to Brazil. Looking at COVID-19 in the Caribbean in March 2020, the first imported case of COVID-19 was reported. The Caribbean Health Public Agency, CARPHA, upgraded the risk of disease transmission to the region to very high. We have approximately 23,792 confirmed cases across 33 Caribbean countries and territories. And unfortunately, we've had approximately 820 deaths. Looking at the type of cases, 17% of cases are still under investigation. Containment and community spread in the Caribbean has largely been achieved up to this point. Now, given that COVID-19 is new without a proven effective treatment or vaccine, to flatten the curve of infection, social distancing measures and border closures to reduce interpersonal contact were implemented. These measures caused economic contraction and reduced supply and demand. The question remains how to fight COVID-19 and not flatten the economy. Some countries have shown that testing, contact tracing, self-isolating, and quarantining can be effective, but they are not easily implemented. There are high costs involved and a pool of skilled and experienced contact tracers and other medical professionals are required, which many countries in the Caribbean just do not have. Looking at the likely nature of the economic shock created by COVID-19, 3 sources can be identified. Firstly, the purely medical shock, where workers are sick and absent from work and unable to contribute to GDP. In the Caribbean, we have largely avoided this. Secondly, is the economic impact of social distancing measures, such as workplace closures, factory closures, travel restrictions, and quarantine. And thirdly, there's a very real psychological or belief-based economic shock, where a lot of attention is not paid. Households and firms tend to embrace a wait-and-see attitude when faced with massive uncertainty or the unknown unknowns of the type that COVID-19 is now presenting the world. The transmission channels of these shocks across the world and the Caribbean, as we all know by now, include disruptions to trading goods and services, supply chains, value chains, commodity prices, tourism and travel, remittances, foreign direct investment, and development finance. Now, to understand the economic impact of COVID-19, we need to recognize what was happening to the world pre-COVID-19. The economic performance of the world economy was already poor before the COVID-19 pandemic. The average global growth rate was 2.8% for the period 2011 to 2019, versus 3.4% for the period 1997 to 2006. In 2019, the global economy recorded its worst performance since 2009, with a growth rate of just 2.5%. Even before the pandemic, global GDP growth projections for 2020 had already been revised downwards. Looking at Caribbean economies, the Caribbean pre-COVID-19 is characterized by low growth, high debt, high trade openness, and low investment, with a strong dependence on foreign aid and foreign direct investment. These characteristics make the region highly vulnerable to the economic impact of COVID-19. The IMF predicts that growth in the region would contract by 6.2% in 2020 and is expected to be the deepest recession in more than half a century. So what would our future growth scenario look like post-COVID-19? There's high uncertainty at this point to know. What we do know is that 4 potential scenarios can play out. Firstly, we could have a steep contraction followed by a steep recovery, as shown by a V-shaped growth curve. This is the best case scenario where there is rapid and effective control of the virus. Secondly, we could have a steep contraction followed by a steep recovery, followed again by a steep contraction and recovery, as shown by a W-shaped growth curve. This is where we have effective control, but we have a recurrence of the virus. Thirdly, we could have a prolonged steep contraction followed by a slow recovery, as shown by a U-shaped growth curve, where the public health response is slow and below optimal. And fourthly, the worst case scenario is a steep contraction followed by a situation of no growth, as shown by an L-shaped growth curve, where the health response has failed and does not bring the pandemic under control. Now, looking at COVID-19 and natural disasters, there is a history of epidemics following natural disasters. After the 7.0 magnitude earthquake which struck Haiti in January 2010, there was a cholera outbreak. In fact, It is quite common that after any meteorological or geophysical disaster that displaces a large number of people, epidemic diseases often emerge. But in 2020, we are in uncharted territory. The COVID-19 pandemic is in full swing, and impending natural disasters can compound the already heightened socioeconomic vulnerabilities caused by COVID-19. This is a potential double trouble that governments may have to deal with in the next few months or maybe even years. Looking at Caribbean economies and hurricanes, Caribbean islands are located in the North Atlantic hurricane belt. The Caribbean is identified as one of the most disaster-prone territories in the world on account of the large number of hurricane strikes experienced. Since 1970, a natural disaster inflicting damage equivalent to more than 2% of the affected country's GDP can be expected roughly every 2.5 years. The historical evidence show that around 11 tropical storms form in the Atlantic basin every year. 6 reach hurricane strength and a further 2 become damaging hurricanes. What is predicted to happen this year? The 2020 Atlantic hurricane season is forecasted to be an unusually active one. There's a 60% likelihood of an above average season, with a 70% chance of 13 to 19 named storms, 6 to 10 of which will become hurricanes, and 3 to 6 of those could become Category 3 hurricanes or higher. And we know the Atlantic hurricane season runs from June 1st to 30th of November. So we have only now begun to face this threat. Unlike COVID-19, which is new, we have several well-established studies on hurricanes and economic growth. Studies show that economic growth can actually increase in the aftermath of hurricanes, while others conclude that growth decreases. The increase in growth may not be surprising, since devastated capital may not only be replaced but upgraded using the most up-to-date technologies. Also, all the infrastructure and buildings are more prone to damage from disasters, and the reinvestment and replacement of such facilities may have a positive effect on productivity and economic growth. On the other hand, though, there's a risk that capital would immediately be replaced by older, out-of-date technology, especially where it is more easily available and resources are limited. What does the evidence show for hurricanes and growth in the Caribbean? The evidence in general shows a small negative short-term impact. There's evidence that tropical storms in the region reduce GDP by 0.05%. There's also evidence that hurricanes reduce total agriculture by 0.5% of total agricultural production, or 0.03% of GDP. In a study of GDP components in the region, the results suggest that GDP may initially increase because of large increases in government consumption and, to a lesser extent, investment, to later contract because of large decreases in private consumption and exports before bouncing back. Now, in some of our latest research, this is with Professor Eric Strobel and I mean recent in terms of preparing for this presentation, we attempt to estimate current and medium-term losses for the region from hurricanes for the next 5 years, and this is what this graph shows, the predicted wind speed if a storm should form. The model uses hurricane track data from the National Hurricane Center, best track data, which provides information on the location of the hurricane eye at 6-hour intervals, as well as the maximum wind speed, and uses a wind field model and asset exposure to provide a measure of potential hurricane destruction. And basically, the brighter colors indicate higher wind speed and consequently potentially more destruction. We can therefore see which countries in the region are expected to be more affected and require a greater level of preparedness as we face COVID-19 and hurricanes. Now, using these potential destruction from the wind speeds calculated, this table shows the total expected damage as a percent of the exposed assets over the next 5 years. And we can see some countries like Jamaica, the destruction could be quite high, as much as 12%, and Antigua and Barbuda, 10%. Now, going back to COVID-19, at the moment, it is difficult for us to obtain these types of loss estimates for COVID-19 in the Caribbean because there are just too many unknowns at this time. In going about obtaining estimates for COVID-19, however, we do know that there are major differences between the external shock created by COVID-19 versus hurricanes. Firstly, for COVID-19, there is no immediate, extensive physical destruction to infrastructure and assets. Secondly, the impact of COVID-19 is being felt across all countries in the world, unlike hurricanes, which are localized events. Thirdly, the impact of COVID-19 is medium to long term. COVID-19 began some 6 months ago in December 2019, unlike hurricanes, which are very short term. Fourthly, the impact of COVID-19 is a simultaneous supply and demand shock. Hurricanes are generally supply shocks. Fifthly, the impact of COVID-19 is taking up the bulk of resources, expertise, time, and effort in all countries. Neighboring countries can offer little help. Given these differences, any loss estimated from COVID-19 in the Caribbean may be larger than those from hurricanes, since COVID-19 is affecting the entire economy, world economy, and the effect would definitely be more long-lasting. So in wrapping up, what should our policy response look like for COVID-19 and hurricanes? Well, preparation and collaboration are key. Countries need to have a prepared health response, sufficient PPE and emergency kits, trained medical professionals, first responders, and emergency volunteers on social distancing measures during hurricanes, redesigning emergency shelters for social distancing, ramped up natural disaster social safety nets to support the most vulnerable, and strong community bonds through social media and telephone contact so that persons remain contacted and can be reached if and when assistance is required. So now I'll conclude my presentation. In concluding, the COVID-19 economic impact for the Caribbean remains uncertain. The hurricane season in the Caribbean only amplifies this uncertainty. The way that the COVID-19 crisis is handled now strongly influences the potential impacts of any hurricane strike. Our economic growth trajectory is highly dependent on the preparedness actions we take now. Thank you. I'll take your questions at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Priya. And I want to once again invite the audience to ask their questions, there will be further chances to do so at the end, but you should get them ready now. We now turn to our fourth and final panelist, who is Mr. Hugh Johnson, President of the Small Business Association of Jamaica, who will speak on the topic, the new reality for formal as opposed to informal enterprises. So will we, Mr. Johnson, will you begin your presentation?
Thank you, Professor Watson. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it has been my pleasure to join you in putting forward this argument as it relates to the new reality that faces the formal and informal sector in the region due to the COVID pandemic. My good friend Donnie Roberts had outlined some salient points which I won't go over verbatim, but I'll say here that he has brought out some true facts that we need to look on in a more forceful way. As it relates to my sector, the small business sector, and the effect on our livelihood and survival, all the report has shown that it has devastated this sector than any other in the region. By nature of our small economies, our enterprises are very minute in comparison to most of the larger economies of the world. And over many decades, our policymakers have been utilizing models that were designed by larger economies, trying to fit in and to allow it to work. And the effect is disproportionate as it relates to our sector. And for that reason, we would like to ask for the policymakers to look steeply on the great reset that is required to move us forward. Because we have been preaching the new normal, but are we prepared to take on that new normal? Or are we looking on the same old, the same policies and programs that have gotten us where we are, that this pandemic can expose our fragility? Are we still moving to get back to where we were, or should we recast the dice? In answering that question, it is clear that people are annoyed. The general populace aren't pleased, even though there are growth and there are forward movement. But with all the resources, the expertise that and expertise that we have, we still should have gotten further ahead than where we are now or where we were before the pandemic hit us. As it relates to this new social order that we are crying for, I would hope that even the trade union can help us in crafting this new social contract that is hinged on productivity as it relates to compensation. All the studies have shown that over the last 5 decades, we have been progressively reducing our productivity level in Jamaica and in the region. And this is an opportune time for us to have this great reset. And for that, I'll beg of us to ensure that we don't waste a crisis as this. I would want to say here that I must commend the governments, Jamaican government, Canadian government, for even the last conference that they had, the World Conference that they had last week in conjunction with United Nations. And we have heard a lot of good words, a lot of rhetoric, and may I say even lamentation. But from where we stand and for our survival, we would ask for the lamentation to cease and we move to action. Some of those actions that we clamor for is one, as it relates to moving forward, training. Over decades, enough emphasis has not been placed on training of the workforce, training of the enterprises that would operate within the sphere. And we ask for greater resources to be placed there, because it's not a lack of expertise, because we have academia, we have the experience. I think what we lack is the will, and we need to get that to move the process forward. Another area of great reset that we crave is in financing. You would have realized that all the studies, World Bank studies, will point that financial inclusion is a bugbear, a great disincentive to our forward movement. They have designed programs to correct that, but it's still not being implemented in its fulsome form. And we have, as I said, all the lamentation and the rhetoric, but we need firm action. The third, which I would like to address as a solution to these hurdles, are facilitation. Because of our mere size, we from this sector is unable to properly maneuver ourselves through the governmental agencies that has been established to facilitate us. We need to move away from being gatekeepers to facilitators. As you would have seen from the various reports, if I may use Jamaica as an example, we have over 43,000 enterprises operating in the MSME sector. Of this 43,000, 1,800 as medium enterprises, 6,000 as small enterprise, and a whopping 35,000 as micro enterprise operators. And for that, our development agency like DBJ, our financing sector like the banks and other financial institutions, none has developed a workable, worthwhile program for this micro sector. They may have facilities and programs and products for the other two, which is the small and the medium, but none in a substantive way from the micro sector. And it would seem foolhardy to believe that you can start building a sustainable economic workforce and society without first ensuring that the base is sound and firm. And I would refer to the micro sector as the base. If we want to look further on some of the recent report as it relates to even our employment rate, which has happily increased over the last few years, but sadly, the poverty rate has also gotten worse. So in analyzing that situation, it is showing us that we have more Jamaicans working harder into poverty. That can be good for our society. That can be the ultimate way to go. So there must be a great reset of our priorities and our programs to enable us to move forward, especially since we have gotten this glorious opportunity to restart afresh. And finally, in closing, I would want to say that all the reports have indicated that inclusive growth has been eluding us, because all those years that we have seen significant growth in Jamaica's economy, the inclusivity of the wider populace has gotten worse. So for those reasons, we are asking for a more profound strategy to be applied to enable us to achieve better training, more inclusive financing, and better facilitation. Because out of statin and TAJ, just last month report will show us that employment in the formal economy stands at around 520,000 persons. And the same report will show you that employment in the informal economy stands at 460,000. So a mere 60,000 difference is not much. And Danny pointed to it before where he says that, and other reports have suggested that the informal economy is on even keel 50-50 with the formal economy. But I beg to differ that the informal is even greater because of that level of informality. We suspect that some of those informal operators cannot be captured in this report. So at this time, I would want to bring my presentation to a close and ask for us to entreat the authority, entreat the governments to be more proactive in enabling us to have more training as it relates to our enterprise through education, financing through education, and facilitation through education of the agencies of state that should be able to facilitate us. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our final presenter, Hugh Johnson. I now want to simply remind you that we are in the SALISES webinar on the topic New Economy Models, Post-COVID-19 Policies for Productivity, Health and Social Wealth. We have heard from the four presenters. We have heard from Dr. Patricia Nortova on the topic Unsettling Neoliberal Philosophies for a New Economy, Donald Roberts on the topic Labor Dynamics, Priya Mohan on the topic Dual Risk of Hurricane and COVID-19, and finally, Mr. Hugh Johnson on the topic The New Reality for Formal versus Informal Enterprises. We now want to turn to questions, and there are two questions that we navigate through the technology, yes. The first question is specifically for Mr. Danny Roberts, and it asks, COVID-19 shows that remittances are not as stable and persistent as we thought. Should Jamaica continue to rely on remittances, or that is labor income from abroad, as its second largest source of hard currencies? What's the first source? I will probably want to dispute the answer to that one. The second question is very general, and the entire audience can take it, although I suspect it will be, it can be suited to anybody. And it asks, can we say that the crisis of COVID-19 has exposed to some degree why neoliberal economies, it's therefore probably related more to what Pat presented, are unfit to deal with a pandemic such as this one? So in the meanwhile, people can prepare their other questions, and let's proceed with those two. The first one to Danny Roberts, and the second one to everybody, but principally to Pat Nortova. So let's begin.
Thank you, Chair. We're going to always be having remittances, and I'm not sure if it's an attempt to make it the first or second or third highest foreign exchange earner. It is what it is. We have a high level of migration, and people send back money in order to be able to take care of their household. What we need to do is to diversify our foreign exchange earnings and find other ways of earning and foreign exchange income. So it is not a reliance of one against the other. Remittances will always be with us, but it's just a question of how it is, therefore, that we can diversify, get into export earnings, expand in other areas that will bring us needed foreign exchange and create a better economy. So it's not.
May I ask, just before I close, are remittances in decline? Because I remember in 2008, they did not go into any great decline. Huh? So are they in decline?
When compared to when? They did.
So before COVID-19.
No, there was a slight decline in the 2008-2009 period. There's a slight decline, yes. Marginal decline. I'm not sure the extent of the decline in the post-COVID-19. I'm not sure. I would have got the figures on that, but I haven't seen anything to indicate that there's been any major decline in that. Not sure even the extent of the fallout. A lot of businesses have survived because of this stimulus package that has been introduced. So many persons still continue to have their jobs and all of that. So I'd have to see the statistics. We'd have to check the statistics for that.
Okay.
I don't know if Pat has any
all right. Well, it's over to Pat now anyway. So Pat, yes. Can you? Hello.
Hi, good afternoon again, everyone. And thank you, Prof, for facilitating us. Yeah, can we say that the crisis of COVID-19, whether or not neoliberal economies or philosophies are unfit to deal with the crisis? The short answer is they're not fit. They're not fit for purpose. Neoliberal processes tend to be market-centric. They tend to externalize social costs. They tend to prioritize private interests over public good. And the history of the adjustment processes within Jamaica and global processes of development have shown that inequalities across regions and within regions have reached unprecedented levels. With the COVID shock, what has happened is that you've had a double whammy with the disruption on the supply side and on the demand side with the lockdown of the economies and with the inability for the transportation networks to function as they normally do. So what we face are massive retrenchments in income earnings, in expected flows of foreign exchange from our traditional sectors such as tourism and migration because of the concurrent influences on people's health, right? So the health disparities of the COVID dynamic in terms of the racial profile of those people who, with perhaps the same probability to get ill or to contract the COVID-19, but a higher probability of death. So communities that we would rely on are facing greater challenges than the average, and therefore we can expect that there are going to be sharper impacts in terms of the support and the relationship networks that we tend to rely on as a small open economy. So when you're having this level of social dislocation, economic dislocation simultaneously with health dislocations, you need a very aggressive public sector. You do need a framework in which public investment is prioritized. Our health infrastructure needs to be fundamentally ramped up. We need to have a rethink of our dependencies on things that we shouldn't be highly dependent on. So, for example, our high levels of imported processed foods. Across the region, import dependencies have ranged between 60 to 80, up to 90%. In the case of wheat, it's 100% in some of the small island economies. So there is an absolute need to look at issues which would involve a more proactive state, which would involve a stronger focus on the public interest, which would involve not focusing on the narrow interests of a few at the expense of the many, and so continuing and perpetuating inequalities and therefore a sick and divided economy and society. So I don't think it is fit for purpose.
Does anybody else want to add, contradict, comment on the question that was asked before I move on to another question?
Chair, I want to agree with Pat wholeheartedly, because part of the challenge that we face is that the economic model is not designed to create the kind of synergy that you speaks about, the integration of all the various interests, stakeholder interests into the development of a kind of a homegrown model of development. We still continue to use the neoliberal model of development. Everything is hinged on that. And the fact of the matter is that that can't take us out of this crisis and put us on the path of a robust, sustained growth. And you know, we're kind of trapped in this. There's almost no alternative to this kind of model. Part of the implications of globalization and all of that.
All right, I want to move on to other questions here.
But Doc, before you move on, Prof, as it relates to the remittance, and you had asked Danny the question, just 2 weeks ago, the official report I saw where the expert had predicted between 20 to 25% dip in the remittance inflow. The actual figure was about 9%, so it's better than, we're doing better than expected.
Yeah. I suspect that that is the case. It's something like that also happened in 2008. And the explanation that was given to me by one of my colleagues is very amusing, but I will not repeat it here because it could put me in prison. Yeah, so let me move on to the other question, because they're now coming fast and furious. We speak of providing training, employment, and seeking investment. If not tourism as a mainstay of the economies, then what? That's the first one. Let me ask another one right away. So what besides tourism? And the question actually comes from a participant from Barbados, where that is an extremely important question. And I know that Jamaica also is going to have that question. There's a participant from Peru asking 3 questions, and I want to, if you could take it down. I would like to ask you, no, he says he has too little time, but he did give a special one to Danny Roberts, and he asked, what are the policies implemented by the Central Bank of Jamaica? Anybody could answer that in case Danny cannot answer it. Does your central bank, has your central bank implemented special credit lines with low interest rates for the local banks to extend new credit to the tourism firms and asking for this support? So if you wish, let me just, I want to find one more that came up as where can I find that now? Yes. Oh, well, they're coming really fast and furious now. And this is to Mr. Johnson, so this will be the 3rd one. What forms of training or retraining do you see as necessary for countries and persons to adapt to the new post-COVID world? And for Dr. Northover, what is your take on China using the pandemic to advance its ideologies? I mean, if you can, and anybody else wishing to answer. So please let us begin. Quite a few people have been called in there. Danny, Hugh, and Pat. So if you could answer, and anybody else wanting to intervene in questions that are not specifically answered, then please free to do so. Hello?
Um, Prof, I don't know what happened to Danny. He want to answer the first one. If not, I'll go at it.
Yeah, but you go ahead. Go ahead.
As it relates to the first question, as it relates to the BOJ and the line of credit, they have said that they would do creative things. I know of some things that they have done. The problem that we are having, though, Prof, is whenever strategies are implemented by BOJ for it to reach the end user, it is circumvented. Somehow, the financial institution finds some creative ways to benefit from it instead of passing it on to the end user. As it relates to the other question directed at me as it relates to the training, I would want to say here that we are looking on, we have a good training program in Jamaica as it relates to art, NTA, and even our tertiary institution. But most of these training modules deal directly with technical skills. We believe a better fit would be like art, NTA, teaming the technical training with administrative management skill set, because the technical training will prepare you to go and seek a job, but having that technical skills and also coupled with the fact that you are able to operate your business from a structural sound footing, corporate governance structure, and all the financial requirements to have your business running efficiently, that you can even matriculate to the stock exchange. That would be the ideal thing. Coupled with the fact that history will tell us that after World War II, the first nation that was reestablished economically was Germany. And that's the reason why the German apprenticeship program was one of the main contributors to that. Even their university students, the level of internship, because we complain about it all the time. You get a person with a master's degree and you have to be teaching them how to operate in a business. So with greater level of internship, I think some of those challenges can be addressed. And lastly, with the training, government need to take greater risk in training people how to operate a business successfully. And I think that would help to reduce the informal operators, because they won't be afraid of formality, but they'll understand how to navigate the processes. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else wants to go on these questions?
Yeah.
I just want to add to the question, if not tourism, if you allow me.
Yeah, sure, go ahead, Priya.
Jonathan's question, then Pat can go. I think this comes from our own research, Prof and I. The research clearly shows that governments do not have the knowledge to pick winners. The private sector also cannot choose winners. It's actually the entrepreneur who would take the risk and produce the product, and it's up to the customer to accept or reject that product. And I just want to give two quick examples coming out of COVID-19. One with food and beverage. Culturally, we think that street food should be eaten on the side of the road. Here in Trinidad, we had a big uproar when doubles was no longer sold to the public because of the COVID-19 restrictions. Then we saw entrepreneurs actually packaging the street food and putting them into gas stations to be sold. And that took off. It was accepted by customers. So sometimes as entrepreneurs, you need to take the risk, and it's not always that obvious, like picking tourism or marine or oil and gas. The second example is with mask making. We are now all involved in making masks because of COVID-19. I think we need to think differently about how we do things. Making masks, we can make masks differently. We could use recycled materials. We could try using renewable energy, and we could also try employing socially vulnerable groups in making up masks, such as the disabled and single parents. So I think there's just a change in mindset in finding the new innovative products out there, and it's not impossible.
Okay, Pat, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, you had raised a question about China.
Yes, somebody raised a question about China, if you wish to answer it. I know you have a lot of interaction with China and Jamaica. So.
Well, to be quite honest, I think that in China's case, what they have is a model called neoliberalism by exception. So China is really not in contradiction with the prevailing trends towards trying to maximize benefits for its own entrepreneurs, so its own industrial elite. And the major attraction to investment in China has been its very weak labor force, unregulated structures of labor participation in a number of industries, and it's patterns of inequality which are mirroring patterns of advanced or developing countries. So the real difference in China has been the prominence of the state as an actor in guiding the growth of market capitalism. So it has had a much stronger role in managing finances, in managing performance criteria, and in steering and directing the economy with long-term growth and development plans. So that, I think, is the advantage, as it has been the advantage in the Southeast Asian spaces with the rise of the developmental state, and that being contrasted with the neoliberal hands-off laissez-faire state. So I think right now everybody is singing from the same handbook per force because of the catastrophic shocks to the social and economic sector simultaneously. So there is going to be an increase in reliance on policies which were seen, in my opinion, as being more pro-social and more empowering and more inclusive, if there is an attempt to reduce the kind of welfare and well-being impacts from the COVID crisis, whether or not these policies of mitigation, of reducing the immediate income shocks and providing some basis for sustainable lives, whether or not that will translate into sustainable livelihoods is a different question, because it does depend on the characteristics of the sustainability of the global development project. And as I said, the contradictions, especially in the food system, which has been recognized as having externalized up to $13 trillion in costs, from health to the environment to environmental degradation and contributions to climate change. If you include those costs, then a lot of the businesses that are seen as viable are no longer viable, because they're really not fully accounting, doing sustainable green accounting methodologies to support that process. China initiated an effort to go with green accounting and actually shelved it because of the political ramifications of formalizing that methodology to assess its economic performance. So I would say China's ideology is not very different from a market-centric ideology, but its emphasis on a state-managed process, which made it different, is now becoming less of a difference in a post-COVID period, where states are becoming more proactive in dealing with the crisis.
All right, okay, thanks, Pat. Two questions. So Priya, one, well, Caribbean countries face hurricane season every year, and therefore they anticipate and respond. Is it possible for Caribbean countries to anticipate a pandemic such as COVID-19? One. Second question, that it is clear that socioeconomic vulnerabilities will be tested now, but you did not provide any information about the emergency economic measures that have been implemented before the current crisis. You want to go ahead with that, Priya, while I look at some other questions here?
Thanks, Prof. Thanks for the questions. Well, I think I would start by answering the first one by saying even the world couldn't predict COVID-19 was going to happen. The issue with these types of external shocks, now hurricanes are limited in frequency, but they do occur every year. But given their limited frequency and the large destruction brought about by a hurricane when it actually happens, it makes modeling the impact of those shocks very difficult, in particular, estimating a probability that the hurricane will occur this year, affecting this country, resulting in X damage. That type of modeling is very difficult given the infrequency of hurricanes and the large payout that they bring with them. Now, with a shock like COVID-19, that's even more infrequent. The last global pandemic would have been the Spanish flu. It's even more difficult to model those types of shocks. So it's something that we cannot predict. Now, the second question in terms of the emergency measures, I'm guessing that the person was asking what Caribbean countries have in place in anticipation that they will be affected by hurricanes. The Caribbean region does benefit and are part of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. And this facility does give a payout when Caribbean countries are affected by natural disasters, including hurricanes. Now, this payoff from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility is usually not large enough to cover the actual destruction caused by hurricanes. And in the region, most countries then rely on debt. We've seen recently where international aid has dried up in the region when we were affected by a hurricane because of the high income status of our countries, and we rely mainly on debt. This has increased our debt to GDP levels to very high levels. What most countries have been doing now, we've been trying to borrow internally, raising funds internally rather than externally. I've also seen in the case of Barbados, where now in the literature it's recommended that fiscal management policies be redesigned so that they anticipate these shocks every year and an actual budget allocation is made to cover these shocks when they do occur. Now, given the limited resources the Caribbean countries face, this is difficult to implement, but I've seen Barbados trying to do it with its Barbados Economic Recovery Transformation Program. Apart from Barbados, many countries in the region do not have these types of programs in place.
Okay, anybody else want to raise anything? There is in fact, yes.
Yes, Chair. But I think there's a common acceptance that the ILO, the World Bank, the IMF, that the real problem that we face stems from the fact that we don't have enough measures in place that create a balanced, a fair, equitable, and a just economy. And so, for example, many of the countries that lack the proper social protection measures are said to going to find it far more difficult to recover from any crisis, whether it be COVID or an economic crisis, because of the absence of measures that protect income, that protect jobs, and that provide some level of social protection. So that is accepted by right across the spectrum. The problem is, how do we solve that? And certainly when you look at the proposals being made by the World Bank and the IMF, they're really into cash transfers, that the government must fund more social programs, etc. And so their efforts at resolving the problem is not structural. What we have to do is to move to some structural changes, legislative changes, policy, active labor market policy changes that can begin to create the structural and fundamental shift in the nature of the economy in order to be able to make it more equitable and all of that. And that is where the fundamental difference lies in how we're approaching a problem that we've all identified its common feature.
Okay, I'm seeing some comments here. I am trying to, because some of them are fairly lengthy, and I just want to say, yes, someone is responding, I think, to you, Priya, that even if the government doesn't pick winners, some form of reorientation is needed. I'm not sure how you're going to respond to that. It's not a full response, but if you want in the meanwhile to think of something. And there's a person here saying and providing evidence that the pandemic was predicted. Let me just say something, that there's always people are always predicting a pandemic or a very, very generalized disaster is something that is always on the cards. That someone could have foreseen, let's say in 2018, that they were going to have something called the coronavirus as much as they could be. It would have had to be a superhuman effort, a kind of Nostradamus kind of thing. But there's always a possibility. And even though people are predicting further pandemics based on climate change and so on, but it's like an earthquake. We know earthquakes are going to strike. Where they will strike and when, we really cannot tell. It's not like a hurricane where we know every season we're going to get things and we take the normal precautions. When some of these grave disasters strike, nobody could have prepared for COVID-19 in what it has given us. I just want to add that. All right, I'm seeing something here. Given the increase in work at home policies, and this could be for the labor person, that's you, do you think there should be a greater collaboration with public health in order to mitigate initial impacts? I think that's going to be, if not our last question, or close to our last one. So given the increase in work at home policies, what impact do you think this and technology will have on the economy? And then, Ray, the pandemic may have been predicted. Do you think there should now be a greater collaboration with public health in order to mitigate initial impacts? So I think this is a question based on what is going to happen in the future. And I would like to generalize it in a way. How do people view the impact of COVID-19 on the way we now organize our lives? Let's say how we organize the university, how we organize education. What is going to happen? Is there going to be a greater use of technology? Is there going to be a greater use of stay at home? The labor person could respond to this. What is going to happen? I hear a lot of responses about going back to normal. My own view is that there's going to be no return to anything resembling what we used to call normal. And a lot of things are going to be changing, including the way we educate our children, including the way we do things at the university, including the way we do things in the world of business. There's going to be much, much more stay-at-home work and so on. And I think that is generally what this person is aiming at here. I open it up to the floor and then we're going to close off after that.
Chair, in the last year or two, there has been intense discussion at the global level about the future of work.
Yes.
Last year, the ILO published a massive report looking at the implications of technology, emotional intelligence, robotics, etc. What implications that is going to have on the world of work and how we need to prepare ourselves for that. I know CARICOM has initiated some discussions around that. All of this was before COVID-19. Now that it has happened, what it does in many respects is to accelerate some of the issues, if not create some kind of a new path for some of the issues which we have been contemplating, because without COVID-19, we never saw the next 5 to 10 years as normal. A new normal would have been created. And so with this pandemic, it only accelerates the need to create a new normal. So for example, the home working, which has always been part of the flexible work arrangement, has now come front and center, and a number of organizations have seen the benefit of having work from home policy. That now is going to become the new normal. There's going to be obviously encouragement for people to work at home. Philippines have just passed legislation about telecommuting act, and therefore it has implications for many things. It has implications for health insurance, for accident liabilities, for economic implications and cost, who bear the cost of the electricity bill that is associated with working from home, who provide the equipment. All of these things we have to develop a protocol for and work on. So the fact of the matter is that we were not even moving into a new norm as a result of the technological changes which preceded us the last 5 or so years. And all COVID has done is to accelerate that process and create some new dynamics which has to be taken into account as to flesh out what the new normal is going to be.
Thanks, Danny. Anybody else wants to add to that? Yes, Pat?
Yeah, I just want to say that I certainly would not be advocating for any attempt to return to the same old, and that the new normal, if it normalizes the existing structural inequities that are already existing. So even if you're thinking about moving towards a digital economy and society, you're thinking about currently infrastructure networks which only access maybe 50, 60% maximum of the population in Jamaica, and globally and in lower, least developed countries, it is much less. So you already have massive exclusions going on. The impact of the fourth industrial revolution is estimated to have a very strong impact. Sorry.
We're hearing you, Pat.
A very strong impact on the characteristics of the labor force. So we know that a lot of work, a lot of tasks are going to be shedded. We also know that there's going to be at least one study has predicted up to 45% of jobs lost in the US economy. In other studies by the IDS in developing countries, they projected up to 70 to 80% based on the characteristics of work that is done there, which makes it automatable and make them disposable bodies. So that unless you have a brand new social compact that he was speaking to, a different type of political economy where people's interests and their well-being are focused upon, and inclusions, gender inequalities, race inequalities, inequalities which have structurally left the majority of our populations in rural areas counted amongst the most poor, chronic poor. Those circumstances can't be sustainable. So obviously the new path forward must be a massive assault on patterns of inequality and exclusion if you're going to have a viable social compact.
I think I just want to say that I agree fully with that, Pat. And I think we have a splendid opportunity. In fact, if anything, COVID has provided us with a splendid opportunity to attack what you call, I wrote it down because I want to use it again, the gaping fault lines in the society, because they have been exposed, and we're seeing it play out in the United States of America at this point in time. It's not just the incident of the murder that is causing all of this. People are frustrated by the gaping fault lines and the gaping inequalities that we see in societies like the United States of America, and of course in Jamaica and in Trinidad and Tobago. All right, I think we have said enough, unless somebody wants to add one last word. I'm going to give somebody a chance to say one last word, because otherwise, Hugh, I hear you want to intervene.
Yeah, yes, Prof. Just to say on the area of picking winners, as was said by Doc earlier, for Jamaican purpose, we are saying that what can revolutionize the economy of Jamaica is a logistics center economy. Not downplaying mining, not downplaying tourism. They all must come in the mix to complement the whole thing. But if the government should focus on a logistics centered economy, even there are greater benefits for the small business sector in that regard. And you have seen it around the world as it relates to how logistics centers revolutionize economies. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, and let me just add to that, Hugh. I myself have very serious concerns about tourism, and I am a little bit concerned about the rush to go back into tourism for all kinds of reasons, and if only because travel to and from the Caribbean is now going to be much more expensive. And even if it starts off by being a little bit cheaper, the airlines will not be able to sustain it. So we're going to have to be thinking something else or a different kind of tourism. It's just that it does not appear to me to be something that we should be pursuing as if nothing has happened, especially cruise ship tourism. So, and that's just a final word. I'm going to have to take advantage of my privilege as chair to leave it like that. And I want to thank all the speakers, Pat, of course, Priya, Hugh, and Danny, for the interventions. We want to thank Richard for being the technical brain behind all of this and keeping everything going. Kevin, of course, for organizing the overall activity. Kevin is a good acquisition that you stole from St. Augustine, I must say, and I know he's happy to be home. We are not happy to have him back home, but that is fine. He's doing a good job there. So thanks to all the people, all the participants who came out and joined us, and do have an excellent evening. And we look forward to future webinars, sponsored by the SALISES.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks for those individuals who made the time to participate in our webinar. We look forward to seeing you in our future webinars. And so please log on to our SALISES YouTube channel that will advertise our additional events.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm shutting down now. Richard, is everything okay? Is he there still?
Yes, everything.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah. Okay, Richard. Thanks very much. Huh? Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Bye, everyone, all the panelists. Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, Prof.
Bye, Pop. Take care.